Is this going? And at the beginning of my meditation, I started to contemplate all of the fathers that I have known, and how many of them have gone. And was thinking about their influence on me and throughout my life. And then I let go and started to focus on the mindfulness of the body. I'm going to talk today about a subject that's a little bit profound, a little deeper than usual. Master was actually going to give the talk today, but he is a little bit delayed in Brazil, so not easy to get here. So he's switched with me. I believe, if I understand correctly, the word Shifu in Chinese means teacher and father. Is that right? I'm going to talk today about what's called the hidden vortex. That's a topic that just the name of it gets my attention. Or the subtitle is, Why Can't We See Clearly Who We Are? So I want to talk about this subject today. And I'm using as a reference a few different texts. The term, the hidden vortex, for those people who read Bhikkhu Bodhi, you know that he uses that term, but he cites in his work that the original term, the hidden vortex, comes from Bhikkhu Nyananda, who first used that phrase in a commentary that he wrote on the Kalakarama Sutta. This is a very short sutta, or discourse of the Buddha, and his commentary is called The Magic of the Mind, an exposition of the Kalakarama Sutta. This is a very short text that most people don't really spend much time on because it's very terse and confusing. And as a result, it's not one that we would normally read when we read about the Buddha's teachings. I'm going to read to you the final verse so you can get a little bit of an essence of how confusing it is and how this is. Then I'll talk about how this is connected to the hidden vortex, etc. Whatever is seen or heard or sensed and fastened onto as true by others, one who is such among the self-fettered wouldn't further claim to be true or even false. Having seen well in advance that the arrow where generations are fastened and hung, I know, I see, that's just how it is. There is nothing of the Tathagata fastened. Now that's very clear, everybody's got that. Okay. So Bhikkhu Nyananda says, the most outstanding contribution made by the law of dependent arising, this is the 12 links, to the ethical and psychological and philosophical inquiries of all times is the revelation that there is a vortex hidden beneath the flux of all mental life, perpetually supporting each other and revitalizing each other as they go dotting around and round. Consciousness and name and form make up the samsaric vortex, which is the rallying point of all existence. Whoa. People may be familiar with a small verse, much more easily understood in a sense, called the Jata Sutta, in which it begins, the inner tangle and the outer tangle are both entangled in a tangle. Who, Gautama, can untangle this tangle? This is another way of understanding this vortex. The bhikkhu goes on, in the wider context of our samsaric existence, the vortical interplay between consciousness and name and form manifests itself as a kind of double bind, a tangle, jata, within and a tangle without. Consciousness, as the subject, always finds itself confronted with name and form as the object, depending on which it develops the concepts of resistance and form. An interplay follows, which is as much comic as it is tragic, in that it involves an assertion of the existence that is equivalent to begging the question. So, Bhikkhu's analysis is almost as dense as the original sutta. So Bhikkhu Bodhi, doing his own commentary on this, from the point of the view of the Mahanidana Sutta. This is the sutta describing the 12 links of dependent arising. Says, the hidden vortex is a term used again by Bhikkhu Bodhi in his commentary on the Mahanidana Sutta, the great discourse on causation. The Buddha goes into specific details about dependent arising, the 12 links, in this teaching. In discussing the relationship between name and form in consciousness, Bhikkhu Bodhi says, the next paragraphs he's referring to in this sutta bring the investigation of dependent arising to the climax by revealing a hidden vortex underlying the entire process of samsaric becoming. This hidden vortex is the reciprocal conditionality of consciousness and mentality and materiality. Mentality and materiality, name and form. But the relationship between the two is not one-sided. To show this, the Buddha alters the regular exposition of dependent arising. So in the regular exposition of dependent arising, the Buddha, if we go backwards in dependent arising, he talks about aging and death, and then birth, then becoming, clinging, and then craving. Craving is where most people begin to find the reason to practice. They begin to realize the link between craving and clinging and suffering. They say, oh, my craving and my clinging is connected to my suffering. So they begin to practice, and then they penetrate from craving into feeling. Now, feeling is not easy to penetrate into because feeling has almost a life of its own. It wants to take you to pleasant, unpleasant, and neither pleasant nor unpleasant, and it wants to make you feel that these moods have some kind of substantiality to them. So when we penetrate into feelings, we need to be able to have enough stability to recognize, oh, this is just a feeling, it's impermanent, I will feel it, I accept that I feel it, but I also can let it go. I don't have to believe it as a substantial, existing on its own kind of mood state. Where does feeling come from then? The person asks, where does this feeling come from? Oh, it comes from when I have contact. Well, what is it that causes me to have contact? Well, it's my senses. My eye, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So this kind of penetration that takes place in our awareness, this is very linear, step by step by step. Again, Bhikkhu Bodhi, I'll repeat what he says, but the relationship between the two is not one-sided. To show this, the Buddha alters his regular exposition of dependent arising, which is this linear connection, we'll say, from craving to the six sense bases. Instead, again quoting Bhikkhu Bodhi, instead of taking the series back as usual through to volitional formations and ignorance, he reverses his last statement and says, with mentality, materiality as a condition, there is consciousness. Just as he had said that where consciousness is, there's a condition of mentality, materiality. So they have this reciprocal relationship back and forth. And he explains this by saying, just as the embryo cannot form unless consciousness descends into the womb, so consciousness cannot initiate the new existence in the womb unless it gains a footing in mentality and materiality. So when we go from craving to feeling to contact to the six sense bases, then the next one that we meet with link number 4 as we're going backwards is name and form, or mentality, materiality, nama, rupa, and then to consciousness. When we do that, we then go to volitional formations and then ignorance as the first. There is this point at which name and form and consciousness form this hidden vortex. So if you can picture maybe an electron cloud where name and form and consciousness are going around and around. So true to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, whenever we look for an electron's position, we only find its momentum. Whenever we look for the momentum, we only find a position. In the same way, when we try to look for consciousness, all we find is name and form. I'll go into that in more detail in a moment. And whenever we look for name and form, we see consciousness. So this goes around and around, as Bhikkhu Bodhi and Bhikkhu Nyaya Ananda says. This is why it is so difficult to be able to see into our consciousness and to understand what's going on because of this cycle that's taking place. And the vortex, in a certain sense, is set up with a type of veil that is there to, in some ways, protect the embryonic consciousness, the consciousness that's not fully formed, inchoate consciousness, just still immature. This immature consciousness, when it begins to contemplate death, becomes very frightened. So there's this veil that comes in our awareness that says, oh, don't think about that. So when this curtain comes down, this veil comes down, it protects in some ways the immaturity of our awareness, but also it's something that we need to be able to reveal to ourselves as our consciousness becomes more mature and we penetrate deeper than the senses. So now I want to talk a little bit about name and form. There is a sutta called the sheaves of reeds. It is just as if two sheaves of reeds were to stand leaning against one another. In the same way, from name and form as a requisite condition comes consciousness, and from consciousness as a requisite condition comes name and form. Here's that reciprocal relationship again in this sutta. The word Buddha in Chinese Fo is a picture of a person on one side, and on the other side, sticks that are held together by a sheath of reeds. So what is this five aggregate? Nama-rupa. Ming-si. Khanda in Pali, skanda, we hear it more in the Sanskrit version. So first we have, so there's name and form, but in the sequence, usually we start out with form. Form is substance. And in some ways, in the Buddhist terminology, it talks about the form, the gross form, but it also means the subtlest form. What's inside that, what's inside that, all the way down to the most minute particle of substance, building itself all the way back up to what we can see and into the sky. This is all form. Actually, in the universe, form or substance is only about, I think, somewhere around 4% of all that is in space. So that's not a lot. And most of it is cosmic dust. Much more dark matter and dark energy. So next, after form, now we have the four conditions of mentality, of functioning of the mind, and divided into these different parts. One is called sensation or feeling. The next is called perception/conception, because perception means the senses, but it also means the mind's thinking. Then we have mental formations or volition. Volitional formations are of three types, and here we're mostly concerned with the third type. So the first type is bodily formations, which has to do with the breath. Speech formation, which has to do with the onset of words in the mind, the chattering and the sustained chattering in the mind. And then the last one, which is mental formations, which relates to feelings and perceptions, as it is that we see above it. But this becomes like a habit, kind of a shortcut of how the mind processes things. And then finally, the fifth is called consciousness. So we can see that within name and form, we have consciousness. And that's why there is this reciprocal relationship. So many times we see name and form at the top, going up to the six sense spaces, etc., and then consciousness below that, and that's going down to the volitional formations. But sometimes, because of this vortex, consciousness is at the top, and the consciousness at the top touches to the six sense spaces. And why is that? Because consciousness is actually connected to the sense spaces. So in the 18 constituents that are talked about, there is an object, okay? So we have the flower, and we can see the flower, we can smell the flower, we can taste. I don't know if we want to taste the flower. We might be able to hear the flower, I'm not sure. We can certainly touch the flower, and we can picture the flower in our mind. We can do all of these things. This is the connection between the object and the sense organ, but the Buddha understood, and people at that time understood, if you take an eyeball out, it can't see anything. It has to be connected to the mind. So this is called the mind realm, the realm of eye consciousness, the realm of ear consciousness, nose, tongue, body, and mind consciousness itself has its own realm. So this realm is the term that is used at the time really to differentiate the process of how we gain information, how we understand and process our experience, separate from the flower itself, the process, the object, and the actual sense organ, which is just a conduit. So this aggregation of all of these things together, that's what allows us to process in the world. We need to have this body, and we need to have our sensations, perception, mental formations, and this consciousness, the consciousness which integrates the information that we're getting. Now, part of the issue of this consciousness is that it has this idea that it can exist by itself, that it's in control, that it's most important. So growing out of this consciousness that is ill-informed, it creates this sense of self. Cuidado, watch out. Shaoxing, be careful. Penetrating deeply into the mind is very difficult because most begin to understand how the suffering develops by experiencing the negatives of craving and clinging. We don't get what we want, or if we get it, it's eventually lost. At other times, we may even get what we want, but we're disappointed when we get it. This is called online shopping. Sometimes we get what we don't want. Eventually, we do get what we don't want, and there's nothing we can do about it. We were studying about that this morning, where we were talking about the simile of the mountain, where the king is told that mountains are coming towards him in all the directions, and there's nothing he can do. The mountains of aging, illness, and death. When I first heard the term ego grasping when I was a young fellow, I thought that this was only about how the ego grasps onto things that it wants. The ego was the subject and the stuff it wanted was the object. But later I began to see that the ego also grasps at itself. It is both the subject and the object. All the grasping at things might even be the ego grasping at some reflection of itself, thinking that the stuff will bring the ego happiness. So this is another term for this kind of ego is an enduring self, our identity, and the phrase, I, me, mine. So as we penetrate into the relationship between grasping and attachment, clinging and craving as per dependent arising, this 12 links, there's the sequence that we come to explore and test out about how feelings give rise to craving and how contact gives rise to feeling and how the 6 sense spaces give rise to contact. And then this vortex of name and form and consciousness. When we go into this deeply, this is not easy to do. This is a considerable feat to be able to penetrate that deeply. And in some ways, it reminds me of stories that I hear about people climbing Mount Everest. There's a wonderful TED Talk that's given by Alison Levine about climbing Mount Everest. I'm a big fan of TED Talks. And in this TED Talk, she talks about how it is that if you're climbing Mount Everest, you can only go so far before you have to go back down to base camp. So you get to base camp and you stay there for a period of time. You acclimatize, you acclimate to the atmosphere. This is like the 4 foundations of mindfulness. You form your base camp. And then you may decide, okay, I'm going to go to Camp 1. And to go to Camp 1, you have to travel across these ice falls. I think called the Kumba Ice Falls. It's very Khumbu Ice Falls. They're 2,000 feet of vertical climbing over constantly shifting huge ice formations. You have to use precarious ice ladders and ropes to be able to go across these caverns. And then when you get to Camp 1, you're so relieved, and then you find that you just have to turn around and go back down to Camp 1. And you keep doing that over and over again until you acclimate. And then you go to Camp 2, and you know what happens when you get to Camp 2? You got to go back down to base camp again. And you keep doing that. And then eventually Camp 3, and the same thing over and over again until you can maybe, if the conditions are right, make an ascent. This is a very good discussion that she has about this experience. In a way, it reminds me very much of the meditation process, where we practice and then we have some realization. But then we have to return to our base and acclimate to the next level of awareness as we go up. And this penetration into the 12 links and being able to have higher levels of insight leading to wisdom, this is called, the training called Guan or Vipassana. This has been a theme of some of my talks. So there's an early text on meditation called the 5 Approaches to Meditation. Wu Ting Xin Guan. Literally, I think it translates as the 5 stabilizations of mind insight or contemplation. And this is a similar method to an earlier text that I had mentioned before, the Da Anban Shou Yi Jing, the exposition on inhalation and exhalation, probably translated by Anxing Gao in the 1st century. This is a very profound text that talks about the stages of Vipassana meditation very, very early. This other text, which is similar to it in its format, the 5 stabilizations of mind or 5 approaches to meditation, insight. Probably, I was talking with Katty about it, and we believe that it probably was brought to China by Kumarajiva at the beginning of the 5th century. Now, Kumarajiva was in Western China, around the same time that Bodhidharma arrived in Eastern China, Southeast China. And then later, these 5 stages were adopted and revised by the Tiantai school and promoted by Master Zhi. But I want to talk a little bit about the 5 approaches to meditation, the Wu Ting Xin Guan. There are 5 stages. The first stage is called meditation on impurity, which, when we look at it in more detail, is including the notion of impermanence and unsatisfactoriness together. In the Japanese tradition, in the Dharma seals, they put these 2 together. But here they are in the first part of this training. The second part is called loving kindness and compassion. Cibei Guan. This is very important. So even if a person is not traveling along the bodhisattva path, still the integration of loving kindness and compassion contemplation is very important. And it balances the impermanence and unsatisfactoriness that we contemplate in the first stage. So we have a balance between these 2. So third stage, what is it? It's called the contemplation of causes and conditions. Yin Yuan Guan. This is very important, because what is it that he's talking about contemplating here are the 12 links. This is where one penetrates from, let's say, craving and clinging all the way down, deep each step, feeling, contact, 6 sense bases, and then step number 4 of this approach is the discrimination of the 5 aggregates. So now, name and form. In the 5th stage, the person returns to their breath and begins to experience these subtle dissolution of the chattering of the mind. So these are the stages that in this method. So you can see the importance of being able to penetrate into this hidden vortex as stages 3, 4, and 5. In the Phena Sutta, foam, It is said, form is like a glob of foam, feelings like a bubble, perception like a mirage, fabrications or formations like a banana, the inside of a banana tree, hollow, and consciousness like a magic trick. This is now going back to the original text of Bhikkhu Nyanyananda. The magic of the mind. He begins talking about consciousness as a magic trick. It is the tragedy of the double bind that despite the transient nature of the five groups, the five skandhas or aggregates, sustain the individual's conceit, I am, even as a mirror reflects the image of one who gazes at it. So 2,500 years ago, there was the Buddha who actually gives a teaching about this to Ananda, just as friend Ananda, a young woman or man fond of self-adornment, in gazing at the image of her or his face in a clean, spotless mirror or in a bowl of clear water, does so depending on something and not without depending. Even so, friend Ananda, depending on form comes the conceit, I am, not otherwise. Depending on feeling, perception, formations, depending on consciousness comes the conceit, I am, and not otherwise. We were talking this morning about how there was a connection to the West that first formed when the Greek soldiers who were followers of Alexander the Great first encountered Buddhism. So this story about the person who gets caught up in their conceit by looking into a pool of water, curiously enough, finds its way into Ovid around 8 AD in the story of Narcissus, the person who's stuck looking in the water. How beautiful I am. In the Ananda Sutta, one of the venerables is giving a little bit of teaching to Ananda. Owing to dependent friend Ananda comes the conceit I am, not without dependence. Dependence on what? Comes the conceit I am. Dependence on form. There becomes the conceit I am, and not otherwise. Depending on feeling, perceptions, formation, depending on consciousness comes the conceit I am, and not otherwise. Venerable Puna continues, what do you think, friend Ananda? Is form constant or inconstant, impermanent? The word in the Pali is rupam nikam va anatta, anachi nam vati. Anatta is impermanent. Inconstant, friend, Ananda says. And Venerable Puna responds, and is that which is inconstant easeful or stressful? Ananda says, stressful, friend. Is it fitting to regard what is inconstant and stressful, subject to change as this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? Ananda says, no, friend. And they continue through feelings, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. My time, I have 1 minute left. So this turmoil constantly between between consciousness and mental formations, when it whirls around and becomes what's called a torrent. This is the word that's used. In Vasubandhu, he says, the mind or mind consciousness is a torrent. In the Nadi Sutta, the river, the Buddha says, supposing monks, there was a river, a mountain, torrent, a swift-flowing stream that goes a long way. On both of its banks there might be growing kasa grass that overhangs, kusa grass that overhangs, babanja grass that overhangs, baranya grass that overhangs, trees that overhang, and a man swept away by that stream might clutch at the kasa grass, and it will break away. And owing to that, he would try to grasp all the way to the trees, but they would break away also, and he would come to grief. So even so, monks, the uninstructed ordinary man who takes no account of the noble ones is unskilled in the Dhamma, untrained in the Dhamma. Taking no account of good people, unskilled in the Dhamma, the good people. He's not taking account of those. He looks upon form as self having form, or looks at the self and the form as the same. But his form disintegrates, and owing to that, he might come to grief. And so it is with feeling, perception, formation, and consciousness. So I leave you with one further phrase from the Mahayana school that echoes what I've been talking about in terms of these conditions. I'll do it in the English. All composed things are like a dream, a phantom, a bubble, a shadow, a drop of dew, a flash of lightning. That is how to meditate on them. That is how to observe them. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the altruistic joy which is free from suffering. And may all beings dwell in the great equanimity which is free from attachment, aversion, and ignorance.